Hello class. So for module 9, today we are going to discuss stereotyping, prejudice, and discriminations. This module is pretty relevant to the current news and the big issues that society is facing. So those would include racism against Black people and other ethnicities. Um, and recently, there has been a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. There's also, sexism, sex-based prejudice and discriminations, LGBT prejudice and discriminations, and these are the issues that is related to social group and how people understand and operate within social group context. And so it would be really useful to understand the psychology that underlies um, these phenomena and then think about how we can make positive changes. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 1. So let's start by operationalizing some terminology. First, we have prejudice. So prejudice is an attitude or an affect we have about a group or an individual because of their social group membership. Right? So these attitude and feelings are sort of like emotions um, that can be positive or negative. So you can have a positive prejudice for a social group or a negative prejudice against a social group. Discrimination is more of a behavior, right? So it's how you or how someone would treat a group or a member of a group in a certain way that is unequal to another group. And then we have stereotyping. A stereotype is not a feeling, it's not a behavior, it's more of a thought, a cognition. Um, so it's a widely held but fixed and often oversimplifying belief or image or ideas um, about a person, um, a particular type of person or a social groups. And then we have racism. So at a psychological level, racism is sort of a mixture of all these three, right? So um, racist thoughts and behavior and feelings are we kind of have a little bit of stereotyping, fixed belief about a social group. We have prejudice, which is negative or positive feelings about a social group, and then we have discrimination, which is the behavior that impacting that social group. Now let's talk about why do we have social groups. And to understand why we have social group, we need to understand why we sort of have groups in general, or why do we categorize things. And according to evolutionary psychology, we have evolved cognitive system to create categories. So if you think back about schema theory, right, when we try to group knowledge into schema that consists of interconnected ideas, it's a way to group things and make things more accessible. And the reason why we do that is as we go through the world, we are bombarded with avalanches of information. There's so much information that coming in. And if the information is new every time, that is unorganized, we might be very well be overwhelmed. Right? So our cognitions develop strategies Well, it would be a lot easier to process these information if we group them into categories, bunch them into groups to create schemas. For example, you might have a class categories of all the ideas and information you have in class. For example, you have class norm, where you sit, when do you talk, or when you take notes, how long is the class, and then what's the attitude toward the class. I hope you enjoy, you all like your classes. And then you have a different category for how you would navigate the social environment with your friends. And so maybe your attitude, you like your friend, you expect your friend to be supportive. There's certain behavior that you associated with doing with friends, for example, Netflix or studying together. And these cognitive categories, the system of cognitive categories are useful in helping you group information together and process them quicker, and make decision better. However, it also gives rise to biases and stereotypes, and we're gonna find out about it more. So people use these cognitive category, especially when they have to process large quantity of information, and to also process those information quickly and then apply them quickly. For example, let's take an imaginary scenario where our ancestor encountered T-Rex. I know dinosaur went extinct long before human arrived, but let's just entertain this scenario for the sake of the example, right? So if we don't have sort of cognitive categorizations, we need to process these informations always like bottom up. We see the T-Rex, we're like, okay, what is the speed of the T-Rex? What does it eat? What should I do? And that would be really slow and would result to the death of our ancestor. However, with cognitive categorizations, our ancestor can process these informations really quickly, right? And just like have instantaneous reaction. That is to run. This cognitive category help us to save time and simplify decision making. And by simplifying decision making, it helps us to conserve our precious cognitive resources or work in memory capacity. For example, when you look at a chair, and if you never see this chair before and you don't have the sort of optimized chair schema, you would have to figure it out every single time from bottom up. You have to process the information like, oh, does this thing have 4 legs? Is it possible to sit on? Like, what is this? Is it solid? Is it dangerous? Should I sit on it? But if you have a schema of a chair category that can be activated automatically and instantaneously, you would be immediately able to tell that a thing is the chair and what is a table. Right? And this saves our cognitive resources and it simplifies decision making. Okay, so this is a critical thinking exercise for you guys. So why does our cognitive categorization system works well for most things, but not other things, like for example social group? Why does it sort of generate like bias and prejudice against group, but it worked well for all these for most of the thing? All right, so the answer is variability and complexity. For most things, there are, not a lot of variability and complexity in in the members, in terms of like the members of these groups, of these cognitive categorizations. So there's not a whole lot of variability and complexity in like chairs, in different kind of chairs, compare to social group. Like people are very complex and very and like are different drastically. So applying a cognitive category to a group of people might generate bias and stereotype and prejudice, because these categories might be oversimplifications of a very diverse group of people. All right, and as I talk about, group of people, you might already found out that we also apply this cognitive system of categorizing to build social categories. For example, we might have a category, social category of Duke fan or Duke students, right? And this category or this schema might involve information just as where they are. They're in Durham, where they're typically from. They're from New Jersey, or maybe they wear YOLO hats. I don't know if any of this is true, except for the Durham location. And how do we build these social categories? So social categories are built based on exposure to environment, right? So, and this environment can be like direct contact with Duke students, or it could just be like information circulating online, the messages from other people about this social category. So then we use this information to encode them as information about the group. And just imagine if you get information that is not entirely accurate about the group, and you start to incorporate this information into your social category or your schema about the group, then you might get an inaccurate schema about that group. So when we use information about social category, there will always be errors with those information, because it misses the complexity and the variability within the group members. In another term, when we think about social groups, and we think that all the members are sort of one way or the other, there are typically errors with this kind of thinking or this information, because individuals are complex and they're diverse, right? So they are not always like the same way in a social groups. Take example for example, like Little Me has a social category of Asian. After watching Uncle Roger videos, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can click on the image to watch a video. So basically, he made videos about Asian stereotypes, and he play up a lot of Asian stereotype. And so basically, from what I learned from the video, then I form an Asian categories, right? So this is kind of like silly example. So I think like Asian like orange color, they like rice cooker, and they dislike colander. And why do they dislike colander? You have to watch the video to find out. So now I meet, let's say, I meet a bunch of other Asian, and then each of them I have like a different opinion about colander. The first person say, well, I have a colander phobia, and that information sort of like reinforce my ideas about the social categories. However, the second person say, I love colander, and the third person say, I don't care at all. Right? So what does that make me think? Well, it might make me question my own ideas about the social category. Was it wrong? and maybe I'll change the information about the social group. However, I would like you guys to think critically. Do people readily update their social informations about like a social category when new evidence emerges? Okay, so if you remember our discussions of accommodation and assimilations, right? So assimilation is when we incorporate new informations into our schema, and accommodation is when we try to change the structure of our schema to accommodate new information. And you might already, have the answer that, well, yeah, typically it's not easy for people to accommodate new information and change the belief. Typically, people would have a lot of sort of biases, such as confirmation bias, that make them ignore the evidence. And just sort of seek evidence that confirm their existing belief about a social category instead of trying to change it. So maybe my reactions would just be like, no, my ideas about Asians are correct, and it must be just some people that are the exceptions or something wrong with them. So it's possible for people to update their schema about a social group given the new information. But also oftentimes people don't do that. People just sort of, trying to change their perceptions of the information to fit their existing schema. So similar to any schema, social category will get automatically activated by a situational stimuli. For example, how a person looked. And this is depends on the salience of cue. If we see a salient cue about someone's social category, that will activate our schema about that social category. So it's possible to activate multiple categories because there might be multiple cues. So for example, this is in this photo is Hikaru Nakamura. He's a chess player. And so when I look at his photos in front of chessboard, right? That's cue number one. He played chess, so it sort of make me think about the social group of chess players, and maybe I have an idea that they're typically smart and classy because chess is a game traditionally for gentlemen. So that might be the ideas that get activated with this cue. And when I hear his voice, right, he have an American accent, so I deduce that he's American. And so it might activate some of the other ideas about the social group of Americans. For example, I might believe that Americans are more extroverted compared to, let's say, European, and they're sort of more casual, friendly, such thing, right? So a person might give multiple cues that sort of activate multiple social category ideas that I have about them. All right, so this is our learning outcome number 2. Take a few seconds to read them. All right, so building upon the idea that social category are sort of cognitive schema about social groups, and they get activated automatically by environmental or situational stimuli. Devin proposed a dissociation model to sort of explain how we perceive a person based on their social group. So based on this model, there are 2 steps to person perceptions. The first step is what we already covered, is the automatic activations of social categories when there's a presence of a salient cues about a social group. And then the second step is in control process. Right? It's called individuations. And basically, after we sort of form an automatic pictures about an individual based on their social category, we follow it up with a control process when we try to incorporate informations about the person and about us, this individual and the situation specific information into our perceptions of this individual, and thereby we form complete pictures of this individual. So for example, when I think of Hikaru Nakamura, like the first thing that automatically activate about him is chess player, and that comes with automatic activated in ideas about how chess player are maybe intelligent, maybe smart, maybe unstable based on the Netflix TV shows, The Queen Gambit. But afterward, there'll be control processing where I kind of like individuating this person. I will incorporate specific information about this particular person and the situations that I see them into my perception of this person. And therefore, I sort of form my perceptions of Hikaru as a chess player. So the automatic process, the automatic activation of social categories based on cues, environmental and situational cues, is the source of implicit attitudes, right? Because it's an automatic process, and these implicit attitudes about a social group actually can conflict with explicit attitudes. So you might have sort of some implicit beliefs or feelings about a group in a certain way, and it's kind of outside of your control because it's implicit and automatic. But you can also have sort of a deliberate control feelings about another group. So these two kind of attitude might be in conflict with others because one is automatic and the other one is control. So these implicit attitudes or feelings about social groups can lead to implicit biases, such as bias in thoughts and actions. For example, if you believe that a group is bad, implicitly, you have no control over it. It's sort of just like an automatic feelings about a group. That might bias your thoughts and behavior toward that group. And so our implicit attitudes and our implicit ideas and informations about a social category, they're developed by our immersion in the environment, in an environment when the environment is full of stereotypes. So we get those information from our environment, from the things that is said to us by what surrounding us, and that sort of gradually create sort of automatic and implicit attitude and ideas about social groups. And so these implicit attitudes, right? I think we all have them, and it's not necessarily the fault of the individual to have them because they don't have control over them. These implicit attitudes, is developed by immersion in an environment where the environment is full of stereotypes, right? So we kind of adopt the stereotypical informations that our social environment give us, maybe like information on Facebook, messages on the news from people who live around us, from what we see in our daily life. And this information in the environment sort of help build up the information about our social category that got automatically activated and create implicit attitude, right? So it's sort of a structural issues, and this is where the word structure come from. So this is where the word structure come into play, right? It is the structure of the environment of our institutions like government or people around us that sort of circulate informations about social groups, and that sort of build up um, our ideas and attitude toward a social group, even though those ideas and attitude might be implicit. And those ideas and attitude typically would favor one social group over the others. So Pager hiring manager study in 2003 demonstrated the presence of stereotypes and implicit bias in a real world context. So the researcher, how the study went is the researcher sent identical applications to hiring manager across the country, and two independent variable was manipulated. The first independent variable is the name. So the applications, the job applications, either has a white sounding name or a black sounding name. And they pilot tested this name first to make sure that they do kind of evoke a perceptions that this name belonged to a white person or a black person. The second independent variable is prison record. So when you apply for jobs, a lot of time the job would probably do a background check or ask you to identify whether you have a prison record or not. Right? So on this application, it will be either there's no record or there's a record. And then their dependent variable is the proportions of application that receive a callback from a hiring manager, indicating interest in an interview. So that's sort of a measure of the success rate of these applications. So this is the result. You see that 35% of the applications with a white sounding name without prison record get a callback, and for white people with a prison record, is obviously they receive fewer callback, like less than half. So, however, with applications that have a black sounding name, and remember these applications are exactly the same applications, right? Only the name change. The black sounding name on applications only receive they receive less fewer callbacks than a application with a white sounding name that has a prison record. So a black person without a prison record fare less well compared to a white person with a prison record, right? And then for a black person with a prison record, the callback rate is even lower, so only 5%. And what even more surprising is that they find, so we can observe that there's a bias, right, a racial bias in hiring decision. What's even more surprising is this racial bias has similar rate among the black and white hiring managers. So black and white decision makers or hiring managers have similar racial bias against a black person. And this finding might get misinterpreted as, well, then there's no discriminations here because black people or black hiring managers seem to be equally discriminating against black people. So, well, everything is fine just the way it is. However, the correct, that is not the correct interpretations. It's actually highlight the impact of the environment, right? Because it's sort of signifying that because both white and black hiring managers are immersed in an environment that give rise to similar racial bias, because this environment might be filled with racial stereotypes and implicit biases against black people. So both black and white hiring manager both carry this implicit bias, and they're not aware of this, right? They might not be aware of this, that get automatically activated with when they see the person's name. And when these implicit bias of both black and white hiring managers get activated, it influences their behavior, which is their decision to call back a job candidate. So you can see that the racial stereotype or sort of implicit stereotype about social groups have wide-ranging impact on real-world outcomes, and they sort of create implicit bias in both the dominant group, the group that benefit from the bias, and the group that actually doesn't benefit from the bias. So another study by Jung and college in 2014 highlight the evidence for implicit gender bias, and this is in relation to hurricane damage. So it's a very interesting study. What the researcher did was they compiled data about hurricanes that hit and and like the amount of death that it caused. Right. So first they would normalize this hurricane so it's equal in a lot of way. For example, wind speed, category, and minimum central pressure, because a storm with higher category or higher wind speed might cause more death. So they would control for these factors statistically to sort of make sure that the all of the storm considered is equal in terms of the strength of the storm. So afterward, they sort of they have people rank the masculinity and femininity of the names of each storm. So keep in mind that this name has been given to the storm before it reached land, right? So people don't know, like, when meteorists give the storm this name, they don't know how much damage it's gonna cause. So what the researcher found is that the more feminine sounding names that the storm have, the more damage it causes, and it kills a lot more people compared to masculine sounding name storms. And why do they find this result? Apparently, follow up with, they confirm this finding with an experimental study in the lab, but the reason is that people perceive feminine sounding name, storm with feminine sounding names, to be less dangerous. Therefore, they were less prepared for the storm. They take less safety precautions, and it's due to people have an implicit gender bias about femininity as maybe being like weak and not dangerous, not threatening. And the reverse is true for masculine sounding name storm, right? They might perceive it as being sort of more threatening, and then they prepare more for it, leading to fewer deaths associated or caused by storm with more masculine sounding name. So Dr. Keith Payne, he's a UNC social psychologist, and by the way, he's also teaching some high-level class on stereotype, bias, and prejudice. So if you're interested in studying more about this topic, definitely look out for his classes. He ran a study that demonstrates the unconscious processing of stereotype and implicit biases. Right? And he does that by inhibit control processing. So he run a study using the weapon identification task. And his independent variable, there's two independent variables. The first independent variable is response time. So he either give participants half a second of response time or give their time to go at their own pace to do the task. So the shorter amount of time will force participants to rely on quick automatic processing and make a decision based on those. And that would reveal stereotype and implicit bias if there is such a thing. Versus when people are able to go at their own pace, they're maybe more likely to be able to use their control processing to correct their implicit bias and stereotype. Independent variable 2 is race prime. So this is in relation to the weapon identification task. So what the participant has to do with the task is that they will see on the screen, right, an object that could either be a gun, a weapon, or a tool. Then on the screen, they also be shown like a black person face or a white person's face. And of course, they're told to sort of ignore these faces and just focus on the weapon. But as we know, these people can just stop ignoring these things, these stimuli. The faces act as a race prime to make participants think about a certain race and make the sort of cognitive schema about that racial group more accessible and influence their decision in regard to weapons and tool, right? And then the dependent measure variable is the how much stereotyping the person do, and that is measured by stereotype consistent errors. So let's say if a person has a stereotype about black individual as being sort of dangerous and criminal, and if they make error that's consistent with that stereotype, which is to falsely identify a tool as a weapon when they see a black face, then that's counted as stereotype consistent errors. Okay, so what did Dr. Keith Payne find? So basically what he finds is that when people are given time to slowly process the information and make a decision, they make fewer errors, of course, right? And there's not much bias for either black face or white face. However, when people are forced to respond quickly, which basically inhibit suppress or which basically did not allow for them to use their control processing and force them to rely on automatic processing. They make more error in regard to black when they're exposed to black person's face in general. So they falsely identifying a tool as a gun when it comes to seeing a black person's face compared to a white person's face. So this demonstrates that participants have automatic implicit bias and stereotype. And again, the researcher did not find any race differences in terms of the participants. So black participants and white participants have the same implicit bias and stereotype. And when he would pay participants to try to be more accurate, right? To create an incentive for accuracy, that actually also didn't change the result, which kind of give a strong evidence that these stereotype and implicit bias are automatic and it's sort of outside of our awareness and outside of our control. This is your essay options number 1. So a quick recap. These experimental evidence seem to support Devin's dissociation model, where we have sort of automatic processing of social category that get activated, automatically and outside of our awareness by situational stimuli. Right? And then our control processing sort of step in to have the what's called the individuating process, where we incorporate more informations about a first person and about the situations into our perception of a person. And in this control step, we might sort of correct our automatic attitude and beliefs about the social groups by incorporating more information from the environment to sort of form our perception of a person that belongs to a social group. So I guess the solution here is it's pretty hard to, or maybe impossible to, control our implicit bias. However, we can exerting control in the second step of person perceptions, right? So we can override our automatic bias by using more time, by having more time to sort of think about our decision and perceptions. So that's the path to change. However, it's not easy. So if you want to sort of eliminate prejudice and biases in other people, well, you have to first, make them somehow have the motivations to individuate. So do they want to spend extra cognitive resource to process information more carefully to override automatic processing? So that take motivations, and even if people are motivated to individuate, do they have the cognitive resources to do so? For example, if they're under cognitive load when their working memory capacity ran out because they're tired, then they might not be able to do that. Also, if they're in a high arousal state, for example, if they're really anxious, that might also inhibit control processing and make them rely more on automatic processing to form an impressions of people from a social groups. So, some of the solutions, these are tough problems. Some of the solution is to focus on changing. First you need to actually change people's willingness to accommodating new informations into their schema about the social groups, right? So they have to be willing to change their stereotype or to update their information about social group. The other solution is we need to change people experience, and which is linked to their social environment or their environment. So this will be more structural change. So if we can change the environment that sort of eliminate stereotypes or harmful beliefs about different social groups, that would feed back into people experience, and that will help them gradually change the implicit beliefs and attitude toward any particular social groups. So that would be a more impactful way to create change. So this is our learning outcome number 3. Feel free to take a few seconds to read it. So let's talk about stereotype threat. So what is stereotype threat? Stereotype threat is defined as the fear or anxiety of confirming a negative stereotype about one's own social group. For example, such stereotype can be women are bad at math, right? So, in other words, when there's a stereotype that is present, it make about our own social group, that might make us anxious of confirming them, and that interfere with our performances. So this has been demonstrated by Stu and Aronson in their seminal study. So in their study, they have participants either black or white come into the lab and do several aptitude tests. And so these either black or white participants was told that the test is diagnostic, which is indicate their intelligence, it measure their performance in school, or it's not diagnostic. It just it's for the researcher interest, and it's not related to their intelligence or their academic achievement in the future, right? And they did a manipulation check to test whether whether access and the researcher would predict that when the test is described as diagnostic of a person's intelligence or capacity, that might activate their stereotype about their own racial groups, right? So they did this by doing they test this by doing a manipulation check. So they have participants complete work that measure like the accessibility of race or of feelings of doubt and anxiety. So if so you see here space act, if a person have their schema about their social or racial group activated, for example, black participant, they might feeling black instead of shack or another word. Or for the second word, right, they might feeling race instead of pace. And for the third word, if they feel anxious or doubt, they might feeling negative feelings words such as shame instead of another word. And then the researcher would measure the performance of participants on the test. So what they find is that when the test was described as not diagnostic of participants' intelligence or academic achievement, both black subjects and white subjects perform equally well on the test. However, when the tests were described as indicative of their intelligence or academic capacity, ability, then the black subjects perform worse compared to the white subject. And the manipulation actually showed that when the test was described as diagnostic, the black subjects have demonstrate that the cognitive accessibility of their racial group schema get activated, so they're more likely to feeling these complete the word with race-related words such as black or race, and anxiety-related words such as shame. So what this research shown is that when the mere presence of this stereotype, a negative stereotype about one's own group, right, would kind of make us feel more anxious of confirming those negative stereotypes, and those anxieties in turn reduce our performances and actually sort of create a vicious perpetual effect that actually make us confirming that negative stereotype. All right, with that said, this is our second essay options. So this is our learning outcome number 4. Okay, so now that we have talked about implicit attitude and stereotype, we continue our discussion with prejudice, which is feelings about certain social groups, and then discrimination, which is the behavioral component that follow. So why do people have prejudice and discrimination? And there were 2 theories that were put forward that sort of give an explanation for this. So the first theory is called the realistic conflict theory by Sheriff in 1966, and what it postulate is that prejudice and discriminations emerge because in the past our ancestors have limited resources, right? And they have to be aggressive, they have to discriminate against other social groups to compete for these limited resources. And therefore the mere perceptions of limited resources can also increase competition, prejudice, and discriminations. So in modern society, for example, in the United States, even though there are abundant of resources, of course there's still people who live in poverty, but in general, even though the wealth and the financial conditions and living standard has been improving drastically for most people, the modern society can still create an environment of perceived limited resources. So it's not real limited resources, but the perception of limited resources. For example, relative deprivation. So and this theory has been confirmed or has been supported by evidence in lab study and also in several field study. So research has shown that where there's a high influx of immigrants into the U.S., that would often coincide with stronger prejudice and discriminations against immigrants or against different racial groups. And that is because the influx of immigrations might create heighten the perceptions of limited resources. The second theory is the social identity theory. We have covered this in previous module. And what the social identity theory say is that the mere categorizations of group would lead to sort of a distinction or demarcations between the in-groups and the out-groups. So for the in-groups, um, people in the in-groups would sort of have in-group favoritism, right? So they would try to favor the in-groups, and they perceive individual in the in-groups with as being more diverse compared to the out-groups. People are different from one another. Um, However, for the out-groups, people will tend to perceive them as homogeneous, right? So people in let's say for example Duke students are like all the same, they're all bad. So so when we look at the outgroup, we have the tendency to see them as being more similar to each other, and also we might have the tendency to derogate them, right? To kind of think or talk badly about them, and think and talk in favor of our in-group. And another effect is um, people would exaggerate the differences between these different social categorizations as well. Okay, so now we know that humans have some tendencies to uh, form prejudice and discriminations against other social groups, right, at a psychological level. But how can prejudice and discrimination get so extreme in certain circumstances? Right? When you think of like concentration camp, mass genocides, hate crimes, etc., how can it become so extreme? Um, and part of the reason is these prejudice and discriminations um, not only operate at the individual level, right? It has been sort of written into or been institutionalized at the group level. It become the fabric of the system. So, for example, if prejudice and discrimination is institutionalized, is, let's for example, perpetuated by government propaganda or by the leader, then it's easy for everyone in the society to sort of like adopt this stereotyping, prejudice, and discriminations. When outgroup derogations become an injunctive social norms, also would push prejudice and discrimination to the extreme. Um, by injunctive norm, I mean norm that tell people what they should do. So in this case, injunctive norm about outgroup derogations mean that you need to or you ought to derogate the outgroup. If you don't, then you're a bad person, right? So it's become like a moral issues to uh, actively derogate the outgroup, and so people are more likely to follow this norm. Um, Discrimination and prejudice also become more extreme when members of social group becomes de-individuated. And what it means is when members lost their you know individual identity and sort of just become another person of the group, they take on too much of the group identity, uh, then they're also more likely to follow the group norms of prejudice and discrimination. And what researchers, the surprising findings that researchers found when they interview and study people in hate group is that these people perceive themselves as moral. They actually believe that they're on the good side. How can it be? Right? I mean, if these individual just commit such violence, how can they still see themselves as being moral? Uh, and one thing is, this is relevant to the concept of cognitive dissonance, right? So people want to see themselves as being moral. Then how could they do such act? And the way for them to resolve this cognitive dissonance is one way is to dehumanize the other group, right? Because so if they can perceive that other groups are not human or subhuman, then it's okay to harm them. There's other predictors of prejudice and discrimination. If we look at the person level, right, each individual might have certain personality that is that kind of make them more likely to have prejudice and discrimination. So one personality is authoritarianism personality. So these individuals sort of value obedience and submissions. They prefer sort of like unquestioning respect for the authority. Another type of personality is social dominance orientations, where so individual with social dominance orientations believe in the hierarchy in social systems. So they believe that some groups are better than others, and they like their group to be better than other group, to sort of like place in higher hierarchy compared to other group. Individual with high collectivism can also have more prejudice and discrimination. So collectivism means that individual would value the group and the group interest over individuals. Right. So at first glance, collectivism sounds like a good thing, right? Because well, you want it like good outcomes for everyone, but when you really think about it, collectivism only apply to the in-group. So if an individual really value their in-group and their in-group interests, they'll be more likely to have prejudice and discriminations against the out-group. And the fourth one is sort of like the opposite. If individuals hold lower humanism or egalitarianism value, which means they don't believe in the equality of all persons, they're also more likely to have prejudice and discriminations. However, there's also situational factors that influence prejudice and discriminations. So, for example, if the group such factor might include conformity pressures, the pressures to sort of conform to whatever the group decide or do. Group polarizations, which is the strengthening of an existing belief in the group or an existing attitude in the group. Groupthink, and then operant conditioning, right? Whether you are rewarded or punished for having a certain beliefs or attitude or behavior toward other social groups. So you might notice that the situational factors does not always increase prejudice or discriminations or decrease prejudice or discrimination, right? This actually depends on the prevailing group norms. So if the group norms of the social group that you belong to is to derogate outgroups, is to treat outgroup with prejudice, is to discriminate against outgroup, then this situational factor will strengthen and that group norm, that negative group norm, and then increase prejudice and discriminations. However, if you belong to, let's say, I don't know, a hippie group that value like egalitarian values, then all of these group situations like conformity pressures would actually strengthen your egalitarianism attitude and may make you more likely to treat other people with like respect and to see all the groups as being equal. All right, so this is your learning outcome number 5. So what we've talked about so far is kind of like really bleak, right? um, like it seems like it's a really big challenge to overcome, implicit bias, stereotype, prejudice, discriminations, because a lot of the processes um, are implicit or automatic, and or is sort of embed in the structural and the institutions um, of social groups, or result from our evolutionary past. So it seems kind of pessimistic, but there's still optimism that we can, create changes for the better. So let's discuss the contact hypothesis. One way that we can actually combat these negative tendencies in human social uh, life. So according to contact hypothesis, if there is intergroup contact under appropriate conditions, um, this contact can effectively reduce prejudice between the different group members, for example, between the majority and the minority group members. Um, and the according to past research, decades of research, several conditions are identified to have a successful intergroup contact. The first condition is mutual interdependence between the group. So the group need to sort of have some sort of dependent on each other. Maybe they have to work together to achieve a common goal, or they have to help each other. The second condition is in their contact, the group need to have a common goal that they're working toward. There needs to be an explicit norm about equal status between the group. Right? So the group must meet or have contact with each other with on equal footing. So this might not work if the groups only have work contact. There should be informal interpersonal contact inside of work, like in socializing contexts. And the contact between this group would be more effective if there are multiple contacts compared to just one-time meeting. And the social norms of equality must be, accepted and make salient. So in this contact, people need to sort of have a shared values that, okay, all groups are equal. Right? So when these conditions are present, intergroup contacts, for example, intergroup contact between different racial groups will be successful and will reduce prejudice. But as you can see, these the intervention that based on the contact hypothesis is not an individual level intervention, or it might not be as effective at the individual level. It would be more effective at the group level or the environmental level, right? Because these is really about how we shape our environment, our social environment, how we change the structure of our environment to allow for groups, different social groups, to come into contact under the ideal situations to reduce prejudices. And this is not to say that individual level interventions is not important. It's always like better to try to change an individual attitude, but it's probably more effective to sort of create a structural and environmental change. Of course, changing the environment and the structure of the environment is challenging, but it's still possible, and it sort of gives us hope that we can create better changes in the world. So with that, this is our final essay options. All right, so that's it for Module 9.